Hey everyone, welcome back for another deep dive. Today we're going to be looking at a really, really interesting question, and that is the U.S. becoming an oligarchy?
Ooh,
That idea that a small group of really wealthy elites are the ones that hold all the power.
yeah,
We've got a ton of research here, academic papers, articles, even some stuff from the congressional record,
interesting.
all kind of looking at how money and politics mix here in the U.S.
Yeah.
And really what we're trying to do is figure out, does all this wealth actually translate to political power?
Hmm.
Does it actually undermine our democracy?
Well, it's a question that people have been debating for literally centuries.
Huh.
The concept of oligarchy, this idea of rule by the wealthy few, goes all the way back to the ancient Greeks, Aristotle and folks like that.
Yeah.
But what's really important to understand is that oligarchy isn't always like a black and white situation.
Right.
Like, it doesn't necessarily mean that democracy, like, completely vanishes. It's more about the fact that wealth can kind of create an uneven playing field.
I see.
It can give some people a much bigger voice in politics.
So it's less about like some dramatic takeover and more about money just kind of like quietly tilting the scales in one direction.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. And one of the things that's really fueled this whole debate in recent years is the Citizens United Supreme Court decision.
Oh yeah, Citizens United. That was the one that basically said corporations and really rich people can spend as much money as they want on political campaigns.
Yeah, that's the gist of it. The court basically ruled that trying to put limits on how much money corporations and unions could spend on politics,
Uh,
that violated their First Amendment rights. Free speech.
wow.
And they basically said that money is equivalent to speech.
Oh wow.
And so this decision, it's been really controversial. It's
Yeah.
had a huge impact on how elections work, how they're funded, who has a voice in the process.
It feels like that's a really huge shift.
It is. It's a really big deal.
When we're talking about like real world examples of this, I
Mhm.
mean, somebody like Elon Musk instantly comes to mind.
Yeah.
I mean, he's definitely been in the news a lot,
Oh, yeah.
both for his wealth and for his political activity.
Yeah, he's a perfect example of this. Just look at his pledge to donate $45 million a month
Wow.
to support Trump's campaign in 2024.
That's a wild amount of money.
It's an incredible sum of money, and that kind of contribution, it can really influence the direction of an election.
Right.
And it raises questions about whether, average citizens, their voices are being drowned out by all this money.
$45 million a month.
Yeah.
I mean, is that basically like buying a louder voice in politics?
It's hard to say for sure, but it definitely raises that question. And it's not just about, direct donations to campaigns.
Right.
Musk also owns Twitter now. It's called X.
Right.
And that sparked a whole other debate about, how much power somebody with a lot of money can have to control information.
Right.
Potentially shape public opinion.
Uh-huh.
He's been criticized for complying with censorship requests from some authoritarian governments.
Wow.
And some people argue that he uses the platform to boost his own political views, especially his alignment with the right.
That's a whole other level of influence. I mean, it's one thing to donate to a campaign,
Right.
but having control over a platform like X, that's a whole different ballgame.
Yeah, it really adds another layer to this whole discussion about wealth and power.
Absolutely.
It makes you wonder, does somebody like Musk have a kind of power that goes beyond the traditional ways we think about politics?
Uh-huh.
The kind of influence that comes with controlling a platform like that.
And it's not just social media, right? I mean, Musk is involved in all sorts of different companies and industries.
Right.
Like he's got Tesla, the electric vehicles.
Court.
He's got SpaceX and space exploration.
Yeah.
I mean, these are huge industries that he has a lot of influence in.
Exactly. And his companies are really on the cutting edge of technology and innovation.
Mhm.
And that gives him a unique position to influence government policies, regulations
Wow.
in all those areas.
So if somebody like Musk has all this influence in so many different areas,
Yeah.
what does that actually mean for our democracy here in the U.S.?
Right.
I mean, are we still a government of the people, by the people, for the people? Or has all this wealth and influence kind of shifted things more towards an oligarchy?
Well, it's a really important question. And one of the big worries is that this unlimited spending,
Right.
that we've seen since Citizens United,
Yeah.
it's created this uneven playing field in elections.
Right.
It favors the wealthy candidates, the special interests, and that can lead to policies that really only benefit the elite
Right.
at the expense of everybody else.
And that just widens the gap between the wealthy and everybody else, right?
Exactly, yeah.
And then on top of that, we've got this whole issue of dark money in politics.
Okay.
Can you explain what exactly dark money is and how that plays into this idea of maybe a shift towards oligarchy?
Yeah, so dark money refers to this political spending where the source of the money is deliberately hidden.
Okay.
It's really hard to track down who's actually behind it,
Wow.
who's trying to influence the elections.
So it's kind of like this shadow network of money
Exactly.
moving through our political system.
It's very shadowy.
And nobody knows where it's coming from or really who to hold accountable.
Yeah, it makes it really difficult.
That doesn't sound good.
It's not good for transparency.
Right.
It's not good for public trust.
So we've got Citizens United opening the door for all this unlimited spending.
Right.
We've got dark money making it really hard to figure out who's actually spending the money.
Uh-huh.
And then we've got people like Elon Musk with huge amounts of wealth and influence across a whole bunch of different industries.
Yeah.
It's kind of a potent combination.
It is.
And it's easy to see why people are worried about the U.S. maybe heading towards oligarchy.
Yeah.
Are there any points in history that we can look back on
Oh, yeah.
that kind of shed some light on what's going on today?
There are definitely some interesting parallels.
Yeah.
If we look back at the Gilded Age
Yeah.
in the late 1800s,
Yeah.
it was a period where there was this massive explosion of wealth.
Right.
And along with that, a lot of political corruption.
Uh-huh.
It was the time of the robber barons, guys like Andrew Carnegie, John D. Rockefeller.
Oh, yeah. Those names are familiar
Yeah.
from history class.
Yeah, they amassed these enormous fortunes and they used their wealth to influence politicians.
Wow.
To shape policies that benefited them,
It's interesting that you bring up that period because
Yeah.
it does feel like we're seeing some echoes of that today.
It does.
With, the growing economic inequality.
Right.
And the feeling that the system maybe favors the wealthy.
Yeah, that's a common sentiment these days.
But couldn't somebody argue that the U.S. is still a democracy?
Yeah, sure.
We've got checks and balances in place
Right.
to keep any one group from getting too much power.
That's the theory, at least.
Right.
The pluralist view of American politics,
Okay.
which is a pretty common perspective.
Uh-huh.
It suggests that power is actually spread out among all these different interest groups,
I see.
not concentrated in the hands of just a few.
So the pluralists would say that even with all this influence of wealth,
Right. Yeah.
different groups are still competing for influence.
Right. And that the system kind of balances itself out.
Interesting.
That's the idea.
But does that really hold up when you consider how much money is being poured into the system? I mean,
Wow.
can the average person's voice really compete
Yeah.
with the megaphone of a billionaire?
It's a valid question.
Yeah.
And it gets to the heart of this whole debate. Is the U.S. really a government of the people, by the people, for the people? Or are we becoming a nation where the wealthy few are really calling the shots?
It's a question that we'll keep digging into as we dive deeper into these sources.
Absolutely.
But first, let's take a closer look at the historical context of oligarchies
Okay.
and see if we can learn anything from the past
Sounds good.
about what might be happening today.
Yeah, looking back at that Gilded Age, I think can be really helpful.
Okay.
Like late 1800s, early 1900s.
Right.
You had this, huge boom in industrial wealth. And
Yeah.
and along with that came just a ton of political corruption.
Uh-huh.
And it was really a time when these robber barons,
That's right.
Carnegie, Rockefeller,
Yeah.
they had so much influence.
It's interesting you brought them up because
Yeah.
we often hear those names.
Right.
But how did that actually work?
Yeah.
How did their wealth turn into political power?
Right.
Did they have specific ways of influencing policy?
Oh, yeah. There's tons of examples. Okay.
Think about the railroad industry.
Okay.
Back then, guys like Cornelius Vanderbilt, Jay Gould,
Mm.
they used their money to bribe politicians.
Oh, wow.
They got favorable land grants.
Uh-huh.
They manipulated stock markets.
Wow.
I mean, they were just
So it wasn't just about having money.
Right.
It was about using that money to kind of game the system in their favor.
Exactly. And it led to this situation where
Right.
wealth just kept building on itself.
Right.
And that led to more power.
Right.
And, all of this concentration of wealth and power
Yeah.
in the hands of just a few people,
Yeah.
it led to a lot of social unrest.
I can imagine.
People were calling for reform.
Yeah.
They felt like the system was rigged.
Right.
Like their voices didn't matter, that the government was only serving the interests of the wealthy.
It makes sense that that would lead to cynicism and distrust
Oh,
in
absolutely.
government.
Yeah. And it makes you wonder, are we kind of seeing a similar pattern
It's a good question.
today
Yeah.
with, these tech billionaires like Musk?
Yeah, I think there were some definite parallels there.
Okay.
The industries might be different,
Right.
but that basic dynamic,
Right.
wealth and influence and access to power,
Right.
it's strikingly similar.
Earlier we were talking about that pluralist view
Right.
of American politics.
Mhm.
This idea that power is kind of spread out
Mhm.
among all these different competing interest groups.
Yeah.
But how does that really hold up when
Mhm.
you've got someone like Musk
Right.
who can basically bankroll entire
Mm-hmm.
political campaigns
Yeah.
and shape public opinion
Uh-huh.
through platforms like X?
It's a real challenge to that pluralist idea.
Yeah.
Critics would say that the level of wealth inequality we have now,
Right.
plus the huge influence of these billionaires, it creates a system that's really not fair.
Right.
It's not a level playing field at all.
It's kind of like a David and Goliath situation.
Right.
Where you've got everyday citizens trying to make their voices heard,
Right.
but they're going up against these billionaires with their megaphones.
It's a tough battle.
But don't we have rules about campaign finance
We do
to try and keep things fair?
We do have campaign finance laws.
Yeah.
But a lot of people argue that those laws they haven't kept up
Right.
with the way political spending has changed.
Especially after Citizens United.
Especially after Citizens United, yeah.
Right.
The floodgates are open now
Yeah.
for unlimited spending by these super PACs
Right.
and other groups.
And it makes it a lot harder for everyday people to compete.
It does. It makes it really hard.
Right. Yeah.
And then on top of that, you've got the dark money issue.
Right. This hidden money that we were talking about.
Yeah.
That makes it even harder to track.
Right.
Who's actually behind these campaigns
Exactly.
and who's really trying to influence things.
It's really hard to know who to hold accountable.
if you don't know where the money's coming from.
Exactly.
It's like a big question mark.
Yeah, it's a big black box.
We've been talking a lot about campaign finance and elections,
Right.
but this whole dynamic of wealth and influence,
Uh-huh.
I mean, it goes beyond that, right?
It is.
What about this revolving door
Oh, yeah.
that we always hear about
Right.
between government and the private sector?
Yeah, that's a big concern.
Like, how does that fit into this whole picture?
So the revolving door
Yeah.
is this phenomenon where you have, government officials leaving their jobs
Mhm.
and then going to work
Right,
for the industries that they used to regulate.
right.
And it raises a lot of questions about conflicts of interest.
Yeah, like you're going from being the referee of the game
Right.
to being a player on one of the teams.
Exactly. And it just creates this perception
Right.
that the system is rigged
Right.
in favor of people with connections and money.
Right,
And it further erodes public trust
right.
in government.
So we've got Citizens United.
Yeah.
We've got dark money.
Huh?
We've got this revolving door.
Yeah.
It's kind of a bleak picture.
It can feel that way.
Is there any evidence that this isn't just a perception, that this is actually affecting policy
Yeah.
in ways that benefit the wealthy at the expense of everybody else?
There's definitely a growing body of research
Okay.
that suggests there's a strong link
Uh-huh.
between wealth, political influence, and policy outcomes.
Okay.
For example, there are studies that have shown
Uh-huh.
that the views of wealthy Americans
Right.
are much more likely to be reflected in government policy
Right.
than the views of average citizens.
That's kind of alarming.
It's a concerning finding.
Yeah.
It suggests that whole idea of one person, one vote, it might not be as true as we'd like to think
Right.
in practice.
Couldn't someone argue that wealthy people
Sure.
are just more politically active
They could.
or better informed or more
Yeah.
effective at advocating for their interests?
Yeah. That's possible.
So it's not necessarily that the system is rigged.
Right.
It's just that they're better at playing the game.
Yeah, but the research also suggests
Yeah.
that the influence of wealth goes beyond that.
Okay.
Even when you account for things like political knowledge and participation,
Right.
the preferences of the wealthy are still overrepresented in policy decisions.
So it's not just that they're more engaged.
Right.
It's that their opinions actually carry more weight.
Exactly.
Even if those opinions don't represent what most people want.
Right, and that raises some really fundamental questions
Yeah.
about how fair and legitimate our democracy really is.
We've been talking about this possibility of the U.S. becoming an oligarchy.
Yeah.
We've been looking at the Gilded Age, talking about Citizens United, dark money,
Yeah.
the influence of billionaires like Elon Musk.
Right.
What for you stands out as the most compelling evidence that this might actually be happening?
That's a tough one.
Yeah.
I mean, it's really the combination of all these factors that makes the case so strong. But I think the research on wealth and policy outcomes, that's particularly striking.
Okay.
The fact that what the wealthy want is consistently reflected in government policy,
Right.
even when you control for other things.
Right.
It really suggests that wealth does translate into a disproportionate level of influence.
It does seem like the evidence is pointing in that direction.
Yeah.
That maybe we are moving towards an oligarchy,
It's a real concern.
where a small group of wealthy elites
Right.
hold most of the power.
It's a worry.
So what can we do? How do we make sure
Yeah.
that our democracy actually represents everyone
That's the big question.
and not just the wealthy few?
Yeah.
It's a big question and honestly, kind of a discouraging one to think about.
Yeah.
But we can't just give up, right?
No, of course not.
So let's shift gears a little bit and talk about solutions.
Right.
What can we actually do about this
Yeah.
this concentration of wealth and power?
Uh-huh.
How do we make sure that our political system really represents everybody,
Right.
not just the wealthy few?
Well, it's a tough problem.
Yeah.
And it's going to take a lot of different approaches.
Right.
There's no easy fix.
Okay.
But there are things we can do.
Okay, so what are some of those things?
Right.
Like, where do we even begin with something this big?
Well, one really important area is campaign finance reform.
Okay.
We need to find ways to reduce the influence of big money in elections and make it more fair.
So are we talking about overturning Citizens United?
I mean, that would be a big step. Yeah.
But it's probably not very likely right now.
Right.
But there are other things we can do.
Okay.
Like, we could strengthen the rules about disclosing political spending
Okay.
so people can see where the money's coming from.
Mm-hmm.
We could limit how much money people and corporations can donate to campaigns.
Okay.
And we could even create public financing systems for elections.
So the government would help fund campaigns.
Exactly.
Interesting.
That way candidates wouldn't be so reliant on big donors.
Okay, those sound like good ideas.
Yeah.
But what about dark money?
Right.
All that secret spending.
That's tough.
How do we even address that if we don't know where the money's coming from?
Well, the key is transparency.
Okay.
We need to force all these groups, even the nonprofits, the shell corporations,
Okay.
to disclose their political spending.
So voters can actually see who's trying to influence things.
Exactly.
It makes sense.
Yeah, transparency is crucial.
Right.
If we want to hold people accountable. And it's not just about elections.
Right.
We talked about that revolving door
Yeah.
between government and the private sector.
Uh-huh.
How do we deal with those potential conflicts of interest?
Well, we need stronger ethics rules for government officials.
Okay.
Things like extending the waiting period
Okay.
before former officials can lobby their old agencies,
Uh-huh.
and just being more open about lobbying activities in general.
Right, so people can see what's going on.
Exactly.
So we need to reform campaign finance.
Right.
Shine a light on dark money.
Yep.
Strengthen those ethics rules.
Yeah.
That all seems really important.
It is?
But it feels like it's bigger than just policy solutions.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's also about a change in how we think about things.
Yeah.
Like recognizing that our democracy is fragile
It is.
and that we have to actively protect it.
Absolutely.
So it's about civic engagement,
Right.
education,
Uh-huh.
creating a culture of accountability.
Yeah, we need people to understand the issues, to get involved in the political process,
Right.
and hold their leaders accountable.
It's about reminding people that they have a voice.
Yeah,
And that their voice matters,
exactly.
even when it feels like the system is rigged against them.
That's right.
But with all the information and misinformation out there,
Right.
it can be really hard to know where to start.
Yeah, it can.
What advice would you give to people who want to make a difference,
Hmm.
but just feel overwhelmed?
I would say start small.
Okay.
Focus on the issues that you really care about.
Uh-huh.
Get involved in your community.
Okay.
Support organizations that are working on these problems and talk to your elected officials.
Yeah.
Make your voice heard.
Right.
Remember, change starts at the local level.
Right.
And every single voice makes a difference.
That's a good reminder.
Yeah,
It's easy to get discouraged
it is.
when you're up against a system that feels so big,
Right.
but we can't give up.
No, we have to keep pushing. For a more just and equal society.
Right.
Where everybody has a voice
Yeah.
and a fair chance.
Exactly.
That's what we're fighting for.
Well, that's about all the time we have for today's deep dive.
Yeah.
We've covered some pretty heavy stuff,
We have?
but we've also talked about the importance of getting involved
Absolutely.
and the power that we have when we work together.
That's right.
So I hope this conversation has inspired you
Me too.
to think critically about our democracy
Yeah.
and what you can do to make it stronger.
It's up to all of us.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
Thanks for having me.
Keep exploring these issues, stay engaged, and never stop fighting for a better future.